Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Chatting with the Lightkeeper. As always, I am Edward, and you are you. And I'm just going to jump right in and kind of get to what's on my mind. And recently, I was doing a little doom scrolling, and somehow in the wonderful world of the Kinkosphere that I ended up in, I found some posts from some people who identify as either in, I guess, the BDSM community as a whole. I know there's not like one universal community, but they were there, BDSM post, advice, those types of things. And at the same time, I found something that was personally very, very disgusting for me. And that was a lot of trying to find the right words. And so I apologize if this comes off harsh or not the way I intended. But a lot of simple hate for those who identify in the LGBTQ plus community. And I don't care for that. That's not my thing. Everybody should be welcomed in the world of BDSM, no matter how you identify, no matter your skin color, religion, what have you. None of that should matter. And I am a history nerd as well. And that got me thinking. Here these people are in the community or identifying as a part of the community or somehow adjacent to BDSM because they're posting about it. And their bigotry was on full display. And that's where I got thinking. The BDSM that you love, people who are queer built it. Now, before I go any farther, I want to say, first of all, that BDSM and BDSM like practices um, predate everything I'm going to talk about by centuries and across cultures. Yes, it existed long before World War II. Parts of it, people can argue that have been around since before recorded history. So I'm not sitting here going to talk about, whether Captain Caveman, Regan the Roman, or Vanya the Victorian was kinky. They absolutely could have been. And if they weren't, perhaps they were missing out. But what I am going to kind of talk about specifically is the United States and since World War II. And really, the foundation of BDSM, as we know it today, a lot of that foundation, of course, we could call it the house of BDSM or the house that BDSM built. A lot of that foundation was built by people who were members of the LGBT community. So, yes, BDSM existed for thousands of years, but the foundation for our modern kink in the United States was built mostly in gay and queer spaces, not straight ones. So let's kind of get right into it. In the United States, there's not a single like origin point of when BDSM sort of came to be. It's there's no like documentation that I can find, and other researchers could find that could point and say, here's Genesis for BDSM in the States. But the practices of the gay leather and motorcycle culture that emerged in major cities after World War II, it still shapes BDSM today. So why leather and why motorcycle? They sort of seem kind of maybe as an odd pairing. But after World War II, the United States government had produced so many motorcycles for the war effort that the war has ended and they have all these motorcycles and they're scaling back the army. They don't need all of these motorcycles. So suddenly you have motorcycles that are very cheap to buy from the government because the government doesn't want them; they just want them gone. And the same kind of goes with leather. You had a lot of leather garments made for World War II, from outfits for fighter and bomber crews, to protective gear for the people that rode the motorcycles during World War II. So you have all this government surplus that made things very affordable. And in places like California, the weather is sunny and shiny and a great place to own a motorcycle. And so that sort of helped create that culture by providing some of the basics, very affordable transportation for people, or maybe not everyday transportation. You might still have your family car, but you could get a motorcycle beep and on the weekends go out for a ride with your buddies. And then you have in 1953 a film come out that stars Marlon Brando, which, Marlon Brando's been in everything from The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, you name it, he's an iconic actor. But he was in a film called The Wild One, and he's a motorcycle rider in this. And if you look at the outfit he was wearing, or outfits he wore during that movie, and you look at some of the leather outfits that are still in and around BDSM today, you'll find them amazingly similar. Brando's outfits sort of became iconic, very masculine. And gay men who viewed themselves as masculine uh, during the 50s sort of were drawn to the look of Brando from the film The Wild One. So the leather aesthetic was not, it wasn't a pure kink convention, but it was borrowed from biker culture and also, the film The Wild One. So in a way, Marlon Brando, through that film, is sort of one of the, I guess we could say, icons of BDSM, if you will, because of that leather look that is still with us today. So you have the leather look, you have the motorcycles, and you have people that were coming together because this is the 1950s, and you could be openly gay, but you would be subject to horrible discrimination, um, as bad or worse. And I would probably, the history geek in me would argue worse than today, because it was a crime in many places to be homosexual then. So if you went to, say, the police because you were beaten up because of your sexuality, you were a targeted hate crime victim, well, you would have to admit that you were doing, or that, your sexuality was illegal. And so they would throw you in jail, rather than the perpetrators who did the hate crime. So you had groups that started up, that allowed people who were gay, who were bisexual, to get together. And motorcycle clubs was one of the places that did it. It allowed gay men to get together in a very masculine thing. If you were at work, what are you going to do this weekend? Well, me and the guys from the motorcycle club, we're gonna hop on our bikes and go for a ride up the California coast. Very masculine. People aren't going to be thinking, oh, that you might be gay, because it's a very masculine thing to do. And one of the first of these clubs was a group called the Satyrs, and it's a motorcycle club still in existence. It started in LA in 1954. Other groups still, they still are in existence. Other groups followed them, saw what they were doing, wanted to join it. And a satyr is a minor deity in Greek mythology. I actually had to look this up. I'm not a Greek mythology kind of person. And they are what I would say is the part man, part beast. Typically, we see that as kind of a horse, which of course makes me think of the old cartoon Hercules, where this little man horse thing followed Hercules around. Um, which is off the track and an aside, my squirrel moment there. But the satyrs are known for their being wild and lustful. So that's where that name came from. And these creatures in the wild, they're often depicted in mythology as drinking, playing music, and chasing around nymphs. So Um, in sort of slang, a satyr refers to an intensely sexual man, and that's where their club name came from. And within that club and other motorcycle gay clubs of that time, the elected officers in these bike clubs were really among some of the first elected gay leaders in the United States. And their fundraising was some of the first gay fundraising that happened in the States. And that fundraising often grew out of a need to support members of the club who might have been injured in a motorcycle accident or had fallen on tough times and needed help. So these clubs provided the first elections for people who were openly gay within that community. Many of them, not all, but many of them went home from their weekend ride with the motorcycle club to a wife and kids. Because it was the 1950s and you had to keep everything under wraps. But these clubs allowed for election of gay leaders and fundraising. And the other thing that I found amazing as I dug into this is we tend to think of like the BDSM community. You'll see that reference today. Oh, the community shouldn't allow this, or the community allows that. And I disagree, and things like that. Well, there is no monolithic community. Yes, there are some communities that are bound by location or maybe online bound by a server that they all gather on or a channel that they chat with. But there's various individual communities. There's not a giant monolithic community. And in the gay leather bike scene, it was the same thing. You can see divisions forming fairly quickly, where you had some individuals who could go for a more military influenced and looking for that structure and discipline, which we can now probably kind of point to and say DS. And those that were more aligned with the what we would picture the biker mentality of today, that valued the individualism that riding brings, and also that rebellious spirit that people find in riding. So it's interesting to see that right from the get go, the community was never monolithic. There were differences between them, but the foundation that they laid is definitely consistent. So we have these groups starting, and then in 1958, a nice little bar in Chicago, and it opened, and it was called the Gold Coast, and it was one of the first bars that was specifically designed for leather or leather bikers, that sort of thing in the United States. And one of the cool things that grew out of the Gold Coast was it started out as a Mr. Gold Coast contest, and it has grown, and it is still with us today. It is the International Mr. Leather contest, and there are events that happen around the world, and typically the finals happen in a major city, and people do come from all over the world. In fact, there's a picture of the iconic Chicago Theater in Chicago. Of course, it's not the Chicago Theater in LA, but the Chicago Theater in Chicago. In fact, if you boy, it's a older movie. Vince Vaughn and Jennifer Aniston were in it, and it was about how they broke up Yeah, they were a couple and they broke up. And I remember Vince Vaughn was a tour guide in Chicago. His family owned a bus tour type thing, and the Chicago theater plays a major part in that. But it's a beautiful theater. I saw one of my favorite bands there, the Tragically Hip, and I believe shooting from the hip, so to speak, that I also saw John Mellencamp there as well. But it's a beautiful theater, and it's places like that. So it is very much, it's not something that is happens in a small bar somewhere. I mean, it's a very big to do and a very important and special thing within the leather community. And it has started back as far as 1958, which is fascinating. And at this point, most of the time, you've heard me talking about these, and it's been mostly men. But women you know, who are queer were not sitting and waiting on the sidelines during any of this. Um, in fact, one of the huge influences or impacts that women brought, that you know LGBTQ plus women brought, was an organization called Samoy, and it was described as the first lesbian BDSM organization in the United States. And they published in 1981 an anthology, and the anthology is called Coming to Power. And this anthology impacts all of us today. First of all, one of the big theses that were argued in the anthology is that consensual kink is compatible with being a feminist. You can be into BDSM and be a feminist. You can be a submissive and be a feminist, which at the time was truly revolutionary. And in fact, you'll even still in here see debates about that today in the modern kink world. Can you really be a feminist if you're submissive and a woman? Or whatever gender? It could go either way. But that was one of the theses that came out of the anthology. Uh, Another thing, shocking, that these are things that we take for granted now. When I said shocking, it emphasized the necessity of clear communication and negotiation before anything physical or mental happens between people. Before it had all been sort of whispered hush hush in communities, but here it is. This is the first time it's getting put down in writing. It provided practical guidance on the proper use of toys and how to prevent, physical injury. And that really had been sort of maybe an article here or there in an underground magazine called a zine, but here it is in, written form. Safe words. And once again, safe words were something that some communities used, some talked about, but it was not documented. It wasn't put out there. And this anthology is saying, hey, use safe words. Here's what they are. And that's where that really genesis for safe words is. They also discuss the psychological side of play, the importance of aftercare, the support of emotional well-being following intense experiences. All of this is put out there for the first time in this anthology. Plus, they also encouraged personal responsibility and self-education, meaning you can't rely on other people to teach you about the lifestyle, which is something that we hear all the time. All these wonderful things that we are still talking about and imparting to people who are new came out of this. So if you look at those things from that mythology, that's a pretty good chunk of our modern, you know, BDSM house, the foundation, is coming right out of that anthology. And it's just fantastic. Now, the other thing in history that I want to mention, and it's not that long ago, but in 1991, two gentlemen, Chuck Renslow and Tony de Blasio, founded the Leather Archives and Museum as a community museum of leather, kink, fetish, and BDSM in Chicago. And I apologize, I totally mispronounced Tony's last name. That's on me, and I apologize. And the reason why they founded this museum and these archives was not because they wanted to preserve the history for history's sake. What they were seeing in 1991 was that this history or people were using the AIDS crisis to erase the LGBTQ plus history that goes along with BDSM. They were actively using the AIDS crisis to try and eradicate not only the history within BDSM, but as a whole as well. And they started this wonderful, wonderful archive and museum. You can still visit it if you visit Chicago or live in the greater Chicagoland area. Do go visit it. It's absolutely amazing. But they built an institution to preserve the lifestyle's history. And it's wonderful. And like I said, if you get the chance, to visit, please do that. Um, I do want to just kind of, now that I've talked all that through and tried my best to explain why the LGBTQ plus side of our history in the lifestyle is so important. I do want to just say that this is designed to be a high level overview, and it is specific to the US. So if you live in the UK or Ireland or Germany, your history is going to be much different. But the point of what I wanted to say today is that the foundation of our modern BDSM house, if you will, we can trace our roots back to the LGBTQ places and spaces that start in the 1950s. And it's very important because in the world we live in, there are people that want to eradicate any history, any signs of people who are LGBTQ plus. They want them gone. And even in the world of BDSM, where we, in theory, accept everyone based on their skin color doesn't matter, their religion doesn't matter, their sexuality doesn't matter, their gender doesn't matter. But it's coming and it's here, and there are people that are trying to actively erase it. So I wanted to bring that up. And somebody will DM me and say, oh, wait, no, in the 1950s, there were straight BDSM groups. And I'm not going to deny that. There are, and there were. But they were less organized, and they did not leave a lasting footprint in the lifestyle. Now, if you have documentation that shows otherwise, I'd love to hear it. I looked high and low for it. I couldn't find it. It wasn't until the 1970s that there were organizations. Oh, and this first one, I apologize if I get this wrong, but it's oh, the the Olensch, yeah, it's a big German word, Olenspiegel Society. And then here's the one I can get right, the Society of Janus. They came around in 1971 and 1974, and they were non-gay exclusive kink organizations, but they were influenced by the gay leather structures in the lesbian BDSM theory that was already there. And many people in those organizations, they were open to everyone, regardless of their gender, their sexuality, etc. So you had many people who crossed over from, say, maybe a leather group to also join, the Society of Janus. And so it wasn't exclusive to a sexuality or gender. It was all inclusive. So those didn't arrive on the scene until the early 70s. So I'm not saying in the States that straight people didn't take part in BDSM. They absolutely did. But in the States, it was the LGBTQ plus people who really they built the clubs, the bars, the frameworks, the archives, and the foundation of what continues to shape our modern BDSM culture. So I want to ask you to take a moment and where you can to protect the LGBTQ history that has made our modern BDSM possible. And finally, I want to say, why is a straight guy who is suffering through spring allergies um, sharing this story? Right? It's not my story to tell in a way. And the reason I am sharing it is I am a history nerd and I believe this history needs to be shared before someone comes along and tries to erase it. So that is why I am sharing all of this with you. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you are curious about the sources I used and the things that I did for research, you can drop me a DM. I'll be happy to share them with you. This isn't just me pulling things randomly. I actually dug in, did the homework, and I'm happy to share that with you. So, with that said, I want to just invite you, no matter where you're listening, if you could tap the like, follow, subscribe button, whatever it is that pops up on your screen. I would really, really appreciate that. And it'll just let you know whenever I release new content, which, of course, with the podcast is every other week on Tuesdays. So I hope everyone is having a great day. And if you are in the Northern Hemisphere, your spring is going great. And if you're south of the Ecuador, as my geography professor in college would call it, he didn't say it was the equator, he called it the Ecuador. I was confused for a week. I thought, why are we talking about a country in South America? But if you're south of the equator, happy fall. I hope your fall is going fabulous. And with that, I look forward to chatting with you again in 2 weeks. And thank you so much for making and taking the time to listen.